But let me tell you what she did plant in my mind. And I can just almost visualize it. She remembers the day that slavery ended. And she would date the dates, but she would say, "Oh, I was at Appomattox Courthouse when Lee surrendered."
Hello guys, welcome back to Critical African Thinkers, and today we're going to have a very interesting conversation with Imam Alfred Mohammed. We're going to get into the introductions of who Imam Alfred Mohammed is today, but this conversation is going to center around memories from his slave grandmother. So what got me interested in this topic was when I listened to your conversation with Mr. Pelu, where you talked about the fact that your grandmother was a slave, or she was born a slave. And when many people think about slavery, they think about slavery as something that's in a bygone age that many people cannot call to mind. But for the fact that someone who is alive today has sort of a link to someone who was once a slave, just shows us how close this thing is in living memory, that is just about 2 generations away from us. So I really wanted to explore those memories, those experiences that you must have gotten from your grandmother. So before we go into the conversation proper, I have my conversation partner here today. Her name is Ada. So Ada is going to do us the honors of introducing Imam Alfred Mohammed to the audience. So Ada, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me to this amazing opportunity to have this conversation. Also with yourself, Imam Alfred, welcome again. And as Charles already said, we're anticipating hearing about your experiences. Charles, of course, he mentioned about having a grandmother who was a slave. And I'm also looking forward to hearing more about your mindset today and what motivates you, what your goals and objectives and everything is as well. But we will get into the conversation. I just want to tell the viewers a little bit about you. So Imam Alfred Mohammed is your name, an author, a public speaker, a spiritual advisor, with a concentration on the nexus between sacred scripture, psychoanalysis, historical studies, and African-American social thought. His passion for interfaith discourse, more specifically forwarding the Muslim and Christian dialogue, has made him a sought-after public speaker in both religious and secular circles across the country. Imam Alfred's experience includes being at the forefront of the 1960s civil rights movement, and you actually worked very closely with lieutenants of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. You managed voter registration drives and things like that as well. But then Imam would eventually find himself serving as actually the personal assistant to the leader of the then Minister Elijah Muhammad of the Nation of Islam, right?
I served as an personal assistant to Imam Wallace Muhammad. That is the son of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, the man that succeeded the founder of the Nation of Islam. His son who took over the Nation of Islam and transformed it. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you for that clarification. That's actually very, very important. So you were the personal assistant to the Honorable Wallace Muhammad. That makes more sense.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
But you yourself, you were eventually appointed as an imam, which is a distinguished title in the Islam religion. You also run some programs such as the Mosque Carers, which is a non-profit entity that educates the public on Islam and provides a safe space for community youth. So yes, as you mentioned, you are a city councillor, and you are the only Muslim imam in the United States elected to public office as the city councillor in the 4th Ward of Linden, New Jersey. And you also serve as the chairman of the Law Committee and the Municipal Investigations Committee. Amazing track record. It's an honor again to have you on the show.
All right. Thank you very much, Ada, for that introduction. That is the introductions from the outside. So that is what is available in the public space. But would like to know you more on a personal level. How how would you introduce yourself to anyone you're meeting for the first time? We just want to know from you, who is Imam Alfred Mohammed on a personal note?
I'm Imam Alfred Mohammed, but one of my daughters, I remember I was much more popular in the public sphere back in the 70s and 80s. And she said, I saw you on TV and you were talking all this talk and you were saying you were this and that. She said, all I think of you as daddy. And I am the father of 6 children. So I think, first of all, I'm a dad. And I always say that I am the grandson of Lula Nallen and the son of Verdi Desmond. The reason I make that distinction, first, it keeps me humble. I feel like I'm speaking certainly for Verdi Desmond, who I always wanted a little baby boy to be a preacher. Didn't go quite the way she wanted it. And my grandmother, Lula Nallen. So I introduced myself as Imam Alfred Mohammed, and Councilman kind of comes second or third. Daddy is quite important to me, and being I'm really a daddy's boy. And my daddy was a very race person. I would say I'm also my mother's child because my spirituality kind of come from her. It does come from her. But my sense of self and the sense of the African world and feeling responsible for the liberation of African people, first and foremost, in the Western Hemisphere, from Rio de Janeiro to Halifax, Nova Scotia, is in my heart. And I feel my grandmother's spirit. I can still feel her describing to me what it was like for slavery to end.
Wow. It seems, when I asked you who is Imam Alfred Mohammed, and you immediately gravitated towards saying that you are a father, you're a dad, a father of 6 children. It shows to me that family is something that is very, very important to you. And I think that's a beautiful thing. I mean, family is the bedrock of everything, it's the bedrock of every society. Everything that we do in life, somewhat we do it because of our families, or we take our families into consideration. So I just want to understand a little bit about your earliest childhood memories, your upbringing, what your upbringing was like. How did you grow up? What were the influences around you as a child? What was your family like? What were your parents like? And all those, what was the culture? What was the political environment like when you were growing up?
Man, it's you've given me I have to almost think of writing an autobiography. So let me try to sum that up quickly. Well, my first memories, I'm going to first talk about my first memory, Claire's memory, was speaking to a family gathering. I'm the youngest of 13 children. My mother had me in menopause. I think she thought her menses cycle had stopped, and then I was born. I think she was about 46 years old. So I always had inside of me this urge to preach. My mother always kind of said, this boy's going to be a preacher. So she had the whole gathering of the family, all my sisters and brothers, to stop and listen to me. I don't know what I had said, but I remember that. It was in the living room of my house there in Lynchburg. And perhaps an adjunct to that memory was meeting my grandmother, Lula Nallen, who claimed that she was born in 1860. I intended to check the census tracts before I came on the program, but I didn't have the time to do it. But that's my second memory. That's part of one of my memories, meeting my grandmother and her kissing me on the forehead and whispering something in my left ear. Whatever she whispered in my left ear, I don't know. But and I have to tell you, my grandmother was not fond of children, and she wasn't fond of girls at all. But she grew kind of fond of me as much as she would be fond of anybody. She sort of saw me as the big head special child, and she would always grin at me.
It's interesting that you mentioned your grandmother, who you who you say her name is Lulu, right? And she is sort of what this interview is all about. So can you give us a sense of who your grandmother was? How much of her did you remember? Was she present in your life up until your teen years, or up until maybe you had grown into an adult? So I just want to understand what kind of person she is, aside from the fact that you were her favorite.
I don't know whether I was her favorite, but she gave some attention to me. My grandmother was a very, very difficult, well, to others, and very complex person. She favored me because I was her. Well, first of all, she favored me because I was a boy. And I have to say, my grandmother carried the burden, what the sociologist E. Franklin Frazier said in Negro Families in America, that he called the African American mother in bondage. So my grandmother didn't particularly like girls. I kind of reiterated that because she had abandoned my mother and my other aunts and took her two boys with her. So I was kind of seeing, she liked my two other brothers, but she kind of just took a liking to me. I remember visiting her until she was, I was about 10, maybe 10, 11 years old when she passed. And she would smile at me just about as much and would always try to find some candy for me. But she didn't do a lot of talking to me. Most of what I knew about her was from my older sisters, and my older brothers and sisters, like 25, 27 years older than me. They told me about her. But I do recall her whispering something in my ear, which was supposed to be some secret that she had. And I would tell you, my grandmother, strangely enough, never saw her in church, but she was one of the biggest voodoo persons in the area of Lynchburg, Virginia. She was called a conjurer. And so I think now, having studied African religions and traditions, that she was mostly into the African religion. She never professed being against Christianity, but this is my sense. I'm looking in retrospect. But she did tell me she still referred to the plantation people as captain and reverentially. And also I have to tell you something very interesting about it. This is secondary knowledge, other than my limited. I saw her on a frequent basis. She lived with one of my aunts. But my older sister, who was again 20 years older than me, said to me that my grandmother would not even speak to black people. She would speak only to Caucasian white people. She, again, like I said, a very strange person. What I knew of her telling us about slavery, that I do remember her telling about it. I could sometimes get her to talk about it. So Granny, we call her Granny. So Granny, you wouldn't say you were a slave, and she wouldn't take too kindly to that. She said you lived on the Captain Davis plantation. She said no, it was the Nallins plantation. And she would go on and tell you about, that's what they call the overseer's captain. And it's strange enough, she left my granddad, who was not born a slave. He was born about 4 or 5 years after slavery. And she took her two boys, my Uncle Goldman and Uncle James, and moved back with the overseers, where she continued her business of engaging in conjuring. And in fact, the very funniest story is my grandmother was ran out of the courthouse for going in the courthouse with wheels and bones and all of these kind of apparitions of witchcraft. And they said, Luther Allen, get out of this court. Don't you ever come in again. Because people, mainly white people, would pay her to work spells on people. So she was supposed to be one of the best conjurers in in Campbell County, which is the county of Thomas Jefferson, in the Lynchburg area. And but I never forget. Oh, this is something, a very big memory of mine. Is I burnt my finger, and she began to whisper something into my finger, and actually, strangely enough, the stinging went away. And so she said she wanted me to come to visit her so she could teach me the secrets or whatever she called it.
Interesting to note that you said that she did not speak to Black people and she only spoke to white people. So I wanted you to explore that a little bit in detail. What were the reasons behind her behaving in that way? What was the psychology? Was her father a white man? Was her father a plantation owner or a part of the slave owners? Or how did she grow up to have that mentality that she wasn't a slave and she wasn't going to interact with Black people?
I think you have intuited something. I think you intuited something. I think she was strange. She was very selective, and my older sisters and also my aunts used to always say when she see somebody walking down the street, they would say, "Mama, answer to your name." They'd say, "Hi, Uncle Desmond," and she was, "Hi, who is that?" And then she would say, when a Caucasian spoke to her, she gave another tone. "Hi, how are you?" You know, she had a strange accent, but she would respond to them. She was fathered by a man, I think he might have been Captain Davis. He was an overseer that had raped my great-grandmother. My great-grandmother was a lady, from what description I get of her, was slightly retarded, and she had a withered hand, and her hand had deformed, and the slave overseer used to every morning put her hand in the fire and said, "Let me burn the devil out of you." Because she was deformed, they thought she was cursed. That's my great-grandmother. That's my grandmother Lula's mother, who is Amanda.
Of memories. I'll circle back to this later on. Let me just let Ada take over the reins of the interview from here.
Wow. I guess the first follow-up questions, you mentioned that your grandmother, she spoke with you about slavery. You mentioned more that she was quite, she would name the overseers, she would name the plantation she was on. I want to ask you, did she, let's put it in this way, did she sort of pass on the pain? What was her thoughts about it? What was her emotional connection to it? And were these emotional connections passed on to you in terms of the trauma of it all, the pain, the suffering, the brutality? I would like to know, or were you too young for that?
I tell you what I remembered her talking about vividly. She was and I'm going to get back to what she did pass on, because she did pass on tremendous amount of pain, because she took her boys with her and left my mother and my 3 aunts with my grandfather. Now, she believed, according to her and according to my other aunt, she believed my grandfather had put a spell on her. Now, it's interesting that he was not a slave. He was born 2 years after slavery. I think she might have been older than him. But she really didn't know her age. But let me tell you what she did plant in my mind. And I can just almost visualize it. She remembers the day that slavery ended. And she would date the dates, but she would say, "Oh, I was at Appomattox Courthouse when Lee surrendered." And she said she was frightened, very scared in her language, to the day that slavery ended. Now, I want to now kind of setting that background to talk really about what pain did she pass on? Unconsciously, tremendous pain. Because my mother, too, had no real, I can think of only one of her daughters out of 9 that she really had a bond with. I would have been her super favorite had I not grown close to my father. So I titled my psychoanalytic biography, Virgil's Dream, Virgil's Nightmare. Now, what do I mean by that? Her dream was for her son to be a great preacher. And I met the likes of Dr. Martin Luther King Sr., Vernon John, some of the great African-American preachers of our time, one of the early presidents of Morehouse College, Dr. Mays, and many, many others. Because in my hometown was a seminary that trained black preachers. Even black preachers came from what was then Rhodesia to study at the Virginia Seminary and College. Well, I was perfectly fine with our relationship. We were super close. I was a baby boy. I was her favorite. Because of all of my brothers, none of them were given to really any spirituality. I was the one that visited church with her, prayed with her, and constantly saw myself as a preacher. Well, all hell broke loose as I began to read. And I became closer and closer to my father. I remember the first time that the Sputnik went up in the air. My dad and I was sitting on the porch talking about that. And when Eisenhower became president, and of course, freedom movements were starting in West Africa, at Zikwa. And my dad used to get the newspapers, and we discussed this. And my mother grew to really hate me. So much so that she took a gun and shot at me and tried to kill me. So I was her nightmare. This boy that was a favorite boy turned to be the boy that was really her nemesis. And she would talk about me, very painful sometimes to talk about this. She would talk about me, she would say, there, that boy, that old man and that boy sitting on the porch talking. Look at him. And you would have thought that the enemy had crawled on the porch, but this was her baby boy. Only time she would come to be nurturing and sweet with me was when I was sick. But other than that, most of the time, she had told my other brothers and sisters to pretty much give me hell, and they did. My life was miserable from about the age of 9 until I left home. And I heard that she also told one of my older sisters, she said, that boy, I never understood him. That's the only child I never understood.
I'm interested, I'm not sure which conversation I heard you mentioned it, if it was with one of my friends or with I think you obviously spoke to Glenn Lowry as well. But you mentioned somewhere that you were once told, you had an experience when you were once told to get at the back of the bus, to move and go to the back of the bus. Do you remember that? Because we're going to obviously talk more about we will obviously go back to your grandmother and, your upbringing, but obviously slavery was, born from racist. Well, it wasn't born from racist practices, but it turned into racism. Racism was born out of slavery. So that's the environment your grandmother grew up in. But I want to know your personal experiences with racism, such as the one that's going to the back of the bus. And did it affect you and how you saw, let's say, people who identify as white? How has that sort of influenced your thinking today?
Remember, I grew up in the era of still segregation, like buses, places. I'm going to talk about the bus incident. But I remember colored bathrooms, separate schools, getting off the sidewalk when a white person passed by. We were warned, if you looked at a Caucasian woman, that they called them white, you could be charged criminally with reckless eyeballing. That was a law on the books, reckless eyeball. So now let me turn our attention to that poignant example. My father pretty much was a man who, I don't see how he lived. He was a very defiant of all this stuff. He followed the customs, but he encouraged me to get involved in the civil rights movement. Like I said, I remember when Ghana became independent, Nigeria became independent. I would begin to read. My father was very encouraging. But anyway, let me go to the incident on the bus. So I think it was around I must have been 7, 8 years old. It used to be the tradition, was the tradition when I was growing up, that when the bus filled up, black African Americans had to start from the back of the bus. So they had to fill up, not from the front. We could never sit up front. So one day I just decided after I read that in the paper, again, this dangerous idea of reading that my mother had warned of, I decided, and my mother probably, I get fear now because if she had known that, she probably would have killed me, probably beat the hell out of me. I sat in the front of the bus, right up behind Ryan, and an old white lady said to me, said, "Sonny, you can't sit in the front of the bus. Go in." Miss, have you heard the interstate commerce can say where I want on the bus? So she tried to get another white lady on the bus to tell me. She told the driver, "Tell me I sat in the back of the bus. Tell him, Sonny, you can't sit up here." And she pleaded with me, and she had another lady plead with me. She finally told the bus driver. The bus driver didn't pay her no attention. So she said, "I guess it's all right. He's just a little nigger." And that's, let me tell you something. I remember distinctively when America was a land wherein it was called knowing your place. And most African Americans accepted that place. It was to be at the back of the bus, or as Carter G. Woodson said, a Negro would go to the back of the bus and go to the back, and there's no back door. He would carve a back door. Well, the first time I ever was called a nigger actually was not in Virginia. It was in Minnesota. That's why when I heard about George Floyd, I was not surprised. I was sitting in the YMCA, and I was waiting to go to Wisconsin, and somebody said, "What is that nigger doing in here?" This is like 1964, 65, somewhere around that time.
Now, you've seen all that. You've faced all that. So how does someone who has seen and faced that come to the point that, while you don't dismiss, because I've heard your other talks, you don't dismiss things like white supremacy and racism. However, your focus is on the renewing, rebuilding the psyche of Black people. How do you not fall into that trap of pinning every unfortunate incident, every disparity that happens in Black demographic group? How do you not see as a vendetta that white people have against Black people? And how do you see that it's more important for Black people to rebuild their spiritual, emotional, mental, financial well-being?
I think it's because I had a very rational father, and I had a unbinding belief in the power of the United States Constitution. Again, being from Thomas Jefferson's place, Thomas Jefferson, I would say, being from my hometown. It was my father. And secondly, I went through a period of what Albert Camus would call a negation. The Nation of Islam gave me a negation, and yet an affirmation of I negated white supremacy. I affirmed a new identity. The interesting thing people should know about the Nation of Islam, that internally the Nation of Islam spent very little time talking about Caucasians at all, or calling them the devil. Most of the time I found out the members inside the Nation of Islam that spent that time talking about Caucasians, I don't use the term white, Europeans, were probably the people who were going to work the least, had very negative attitudes towards each other. So I think I've gone through a period where I have spent enough time doing what Jean-Paul Sartre called engaging in anti-racism. So I have finished that job. The Nation was a great drama, piece of drama, pulsating drama, reversing the symbols. The white man taught that he was God. The Nation of Islam taught that he was the devil. So after maybe 20, 30 years of that, my psyche was cleansed, or as Franz Fanon would call it, the portrait of a dying colonialism. I think it was a psychotherapeutic catharsis that took place. So as a result, I have embraced a philosophy that's scriptural, that Joseph would be eventually become the person to reinterpret all of this. So I don't burden myself, and I'm not really burdened by what individuals think. It's more important about groups. And I think it's more important for African Americans to throw off the psychological shackles. I think what we're seeing today, why they can't take the responsibility for themselves, is they still see themselves in relation to the Caucasian. I see Caucasians as another people. And I see most of them that I meet very, very damaged as a result of the burden of white supremacy. They too are burdened. So I think it's psychoanalytic, ideologically, and my work is so much on internal work of improving us. And I think if anybody's undergone 400 years of what we've undergone, and I've had enough personal experience with it, if anything, I think I feel somewhat superior to Caucasians, that I have my humanity under all those inhumane concepts, that I am not burdened by what the hell they think of me or what they do think of me. It's like I would say this. I said this to somebody as a councilman once. They wanted to pass a resolution to denounce President Trump, and I always call presidents by their title, regardless whether they earned it or not. I said the resolution, he called all the African countries, you know what he called them, sewer holes. I won't use the words in polite company because con men will use any kind of language. And I said, if he were to vote, if he were to say that African black people were the greatest people on earth, I wouldn't care. If he were said we were the worst on earth, I wouldn't care. I think that I would answer this way, the same way James Baldwin answered. He said, I didn't answer then and I don't answer now. So I don't spend my time worrying about who loves me and who doesn't love me, who tried to denigrate me. And I really think our people should spend less time about that. And I really like the president of Ghana. He's taking a new position. I think we need to take a new position internally. And as far as the body politics, I think the politics of grievance doesn't help to stitch together a political polity for people.
Just the last question, I promise, Charles, then you can jump in, or more of a follow-up statement that will lead to a question. Now, I personally, what many people say is white supremacy. I don't ascribe it to whiteness. I don't ascribe, I personally think that people act in ways because of their core human fascistic nature that just manifests itself when the certain conditions are available, certain motivations. So you mentioned in the beginning of the call that you're seeking the liberation for our people. And I of course asked about the pain that whether your grandmother passed any pain. So I guess what I'm trying to say is sometimes I feel that a lot of, let's say, Black people, they're more bound by ideologies and ideas and attitudes that they ascribe to, rather than the actual oppression itself. Of course, at the time of your upbringing and your grandmother's upbringing, where there were legal barriers to actually stop a certain group from, from a time that you can have something called reckless eyeballing and probably get beaten or lynched or go to prison. that it's come a long way to the point that we have Black people occupying places of power. So I guess my question is, what is the actual liberation of white supremacy or attitudes, wrong beliefs, false beliefs that many Black people have about the world, about white people, about themselves? And I say that because someone from the United States, a Black person from the United States, may not have that same, for obvious reasons, thoughts and viewpoints as someone like myself in London or Charles in Nigeria. So is it really white supremacy, or is it certain ideologies that many Black people hold?
Well, that's kind of complex, because I think many of us, including Africans, I think of all varieties, have internalized a lot of this white supremacy. And to be liberated, I have to first liberate myself and see myself as a human being, a competitive human being, and understand some of what we call racism is just group preservation, competition. So it's rather complex. So I don't subscribe to some ideology. There's certain ideologies out here that's floating. And let me just say this too. There are people that are promoting an ideology based on the fact that they share this ideology, I think, of Marxist-Leninist ideas. So if you share the Marxist-Leninist ideas, you're always going to have contradictions, as they call it. Been a strong student of Marx, never followed him, but read a lot of dealings in the 60s with the Marxist-Leninists. And I hope I'm being clear. I don't allow what others thinking. I don't think we should worry so much about what others are thinking of us. But there are actions that need to be taken to remedy to bring a egalitarian society. And I think in a society such as America, it is best, probably even also for you all in England, if you're going to want change for yourself, first you have to work on your internal change and not ask the government to do it. But secondly, if you want to move a group that you are part of, it has to be something that's going to include others. Otherwise, you won't get any support for it. Does that make sense to you? You're the interviewer. I shouldn't ask you the question about that.
No, feel free. No, thank you for sharing your viewpoint. I really appreciate it. It makes sense. Yes, I understand.
As you were just relating the answer to this past two questions, I was just smiling internally, even if I wasn't smiling out, because it makes so much sense. Because one thing that you said that resonated with me is you don't care whether Trump had praised Black people, and you wouldn't care if he says anything wrong, if he says anything bad about them. And I think that's an incredible position to hold. We should not be affected by either the praise or the dissing of people. It doesn't affect our worth as a human being. It doesn't affect our worth as a people. You understand? Our worth comes from within us. It is not external. So whatever happens outside us, we can choose how we want to react to it. If someone acts to you in a certain way, we can choose the way we want to react to it. And the second point I wanted to relate to was when you said that some of these things that many people might term racism, white supremacy, and all that is just simply group fighting, which is sort of natural, because even if you come to a place like Africa, where we are technically of the same race, you're going to get those group fighting. You're going to get ethnic clashes. You're going to get regional clashes. You're going to get all sorts of group clashes. Even within families, these things are inevitable. These are natural human tendencies. So how come just because a person has a certain skin tone that's different from another person, does that mean they cannot have a disagreement on a human level? Of course, it's possible. So it isn't always racism that defines such interaction, even though we acknowledge that racism exists. I would like to circle back to the question of your grandmother and her experiences in slavery. So you said that you were about 9 years old when she died. So there were not really much of the direct interaction or the stories that she may have related, but that there are secondary stories that you've heard from your older siblings. So what are the most pivotal or memorable of such stories as related from your grandmother to your elder siblings that they related to you that you can share with us?
You know, I have a sister who was probably my closest sister, and just passed last year. She was 93 when she passed. Died rather tragically because of she was in a nursing home because of sickness in my own family, emotional sicknesses. They were jealous of her. My sister, probably her and I were the two most achievers in my family. And my grandmother told her one time, she used to call her Old Black Goodney. That was her nickname. And so she was trying to beat my sister, pull her away from under the bed. And she said, your dad said he was going to make a nurse out of you. I guess I'm going to leave you alone. And my sister did become a nurse. And she was actually the nurse to John Hinckley, the guy who attempted to assassinate the President of the United States. My sister was a psychiatric nurse. I think maybe some young person may be watching this program today, maybe in Lagos, maybe homeless, maybe someone's watching wherever, going through some very difficult times. The human being has just phenomenal strengths. And we have to call on those phenomenal strengths. Now, I also want to say something too, to particularly our African-American middle class. I think they suffer from a lot of pain and a lot of confusion. What I mean by that, a young man joins a law firm in America. I don't know the British legal professions well, but I suspect I know something about it. Less. You join a law firm, you're an associate. You come in, you've gone to one of the better schools, most prestigious schools, and you get fired. Well, can you blame it and call it racism? Or is it because partnerships are based on the amount of business you bring in? And I think African Americans in general, African people in general, and African Americans in particular, have to be more aggressive, more imaginative, and more creative. That's what's going to be the determining factor in our human competitiveness. Now, my dear friend, Glenn Lowry became an expert on human capital. I believe it's social capital. But we have to capitalize on that. And one of the reasons I wanted to be on this program, other than you all are very interesting people, is to talk to people in Africa about being a continent that needs to come up with an ideology that encompasses all different groupings in Africa. I mean, I'm probably by genetics, check my genes out and it says I'm about 65% Yoruba, but I'm sure if I go to Lagos, I don't have anything there. So, but genetics, and I'm about 12% Pulu, as Caucasians call them, Fulanis. Who, if I get a chance, I tell you about my other side of my family, my paternal side, because slavery is a very complex institution. So anyway, my grandmother was a Fulani and Pulu, and they were favored by Caucasian men, in fact, my paternal grandfather was a Caucasian who left large sums of money to my grandmother and sent all of them to college. Now, my grandmother, being a very light-skinned woman, always married very black men. So that's another phenomenon. The colorism that's in African American, deep colorism. And yet we have African Americans who are physically black, have resentments to light-skinned African Americans. And actually, in truth, most of the African American leaders were very light-skinned. And the reason that they had such a rebellion against white supremacy had a lot to do with the fact is that they were very angry at their father, their biological father, Caucasians. So it created a clash. One example, my high school, elementary school principal, Mr. Gordon Hemmons, who was the son, great-grandson of Sally Hemmons. He changed his name to Hemmons because he was resented being called Hemmons because his great-great-grandfather was Thomas Jefferson. So America is a very mixed and confused society. And I don't know how I got off on that topic, but I had to get off there. I'm spending some time with my other grandmother, my grandmother Lula Nalla, but my other grandmother her name was Cornelia Gordon. And all of her brothers had gone to physicians. One was a lawyer, one was a preacher, something else. I'm named for one of the first African-American physicians, Alfred Gordon. That's my paternal uncle, and my grandmother. Now I knew her much better, Grandma Payne, as we call it, because she got married again to a very dark-skinned man by the name of Dory Payne. But this phenomenon is just very, very interesting. The colorism. I think more African Americans need to address the psychological problems, the psychological effects that has happened to them rather than a lot of the outward. They're spending a lot of time dealing with the outward. Some Caucasian looked at me wrong in a supermarket. Those things. And I think we have to see ourselves as becoming competitive. And this is what I say to young African Americans. You know, if you can compete on the basketball court and you win it, if you can compete on the football field and you win it, you can compete in the boxing ring. And obviously, we know a man I knew very well, Muhammad Ali. Then you should be able to compete in anything else in the world. And I think we have to see ourselves as competitors. The world is a very competitive place. And that's another reason I wanted to come on this program. Despite my publicist didn't want me to come on too many blogs, because we're moving to project our ideology and our thoughts out to more and more people. And I said, no, I want to come on because I want to reach out to what I see you all as a new intelligentsia. And I went over my interview time. And anytime I go over, you'll have to realize it's a cautionary tale to invite a preacher politician. Both talk long. And so you'll have to stop me. Thank you.
You mentioned something about as Black people, as African Americans, the way we succeed is we have to work extra hard. We have to be more ingenious. We have to be more of this. We have to do this extra. So my question is, isn't that proof of white supremacy? Isn't that proof of some sort of systemic favoritism to white people? Why do we have to work harder to get the same result? Why do we have to be more ingenious to get the same result? Why do we have to be exceptional to get the same result that any white person just be themselves would get? So that's my question.
Well, you know what? I'm gonna quote Dr. Mays, the teacher of Dr. King, and he said, the man who is behind has to run faster than the man in front. Well, you know what I think? I think the European Americans have had a great day. If you study world history, most historians don't believe in this cycle of history. I happen to believe in it. I mean, we know Ferguson, we know people like Toynbee, we know the Durant. They believed in these cycles. We know Africa had a long run. We know Andalusia had a long run. And if we're going to compete in the world, we got to look at where the world is. And yes, you have to be better. I mean, I'm sure Muhammad Ali probably thought the same way I think. That's why he became the champion. You know, he studied the past. If he just thought he just going to be good, there wouldn't be no Muhammad Ali. He would have been an old retired man somewhere in Louisville, Kentucky. dreaming about boxing. So it wasn't going to be great, and you've been behind, and look, it's only 50 years or more that African Americans had the right to be competitive in America. I mean, legally. Africa's had maybe 60 years. So you have to realize that in a lot of ways you might be behind, but that shouldn't discourage you. It should empower you. So I think one has to also accept realities and compete to make it in the global markets.
I just want to apologize for I'm out on the West Coast and I clipped in at the wrong time, but I was more interested in just listening. This is a phenomenon, and it's what Imam Alfred is doing is really what I'm calling a new paradigm, because it's not what the listener will think at first. It'll be the kind of thing that after he's done, like tomorrow or the next day, the people listening will say, "Hey, wait a minute." They won't catch it right away because the nature that he's speaking of is down below the surface. And so I'm just going to enjoy the process. So I'm just comfortable listening. But I would say, in terms of what he has introduced about colorism, I will add that in the race, one of the subtleties about the human being, in terms of the state that we're in right now, is that every species of human has a history. And to the extent that what we define as the African American, and that African American experience being the latest of evolved human species, it means that in the African American, you're capturing the experiences, the highs, the lows, the goods, the bads, the uglies of what has happened to every group. So those groups that hate the African American fail to realize that in their history, they had a Muhammad Ali. They had a Sidney Poitier. And so what God has done in terms of the creative forces is he's put us in a situation where, willingly or unwillingly now, we've got to come to know each other. And the best way to get a first seat, front row experience of human life is to study the balanced, as what Alfred is talking about, the balanced African American. And I think that balanced African American is the true balance of what is the nature of what human life is supposed to evolve to survive. We may choose not to survive. I mean, we see what the Republicans are doing, but I'm appreciating that at this age, God has blessed Alfred with this content, and God knows how long it will be. But I think we should enjoy the journey. It's going to be a wonderful process. I'm just a fan and I'm on board. I really don't want to question, but I just want to listen to him right now.
So I don't know if you phrased this question with this intention, but this is how I understood it. So you said, why is it that we have to work harder? Is that a sign of white supremacy? We work harder when a white person can just be themselves. And then that translated to me that, well, the themselves of a white person, I know this is not what you meant, or if it is, let me know. So what that translated to me was that, is the themselves of a white person exceptionalism, and the natural state, let's use this word, of a black person is always behind. And I don't know how to reconcile that, because every single individual and every single group in every single sphere has to work twice as hard as the next person, whether they're coming from a place of exceptionalism or not. The one that comes from a place of exceptionalism must continue to self-develop, learn, to retain their status at the top or whatever. So I like I said, I know that's not what you meant. I just want to clarify from my position that I think this idea that Black people have to work twice as hard as a blanket automatic state is, once this mindset is removed, we'll start that liberation process. I don't put, for example, I don't enter a space and automatically think whether it's a space full of white people or not. Or shall I rephrase? I automatically think I'm going to have to work twice as hard, whether that's in a space of white people or whether that's in a space of Black people. I was born in Nigeria. I lived in Lagos in my beginning years, my childhood, and I had to work, actually, my case anyway, because I wasn't very bright. I had to work 3 times as hard, 4 times as hard. It needed a village for me to just pass exams, you know. So moving to the UK and I have to work twice as hard. Do I then relate that, well, that's because I'm now Black in a white majority country? Or is that the fact, like I think Daniel mentioned, we are humans, you know, this is the natural order and state and system of human beings. So that wasn't a question, maybe just more thoughts.
I would say that, yes, I heard you very well. And I just want to add real quick, if you don't mind, Brother Alfred. What Alfred is also saying is that the human beings, African Americans, Africans, don't realize there is a statement in the Quran where God is addressing, and he's saying to Muhammad, "Inna ma'usri yusra." In the difficulty comes the ease. Listen to this. What you also, my dear sister, don't realize, and it would give you some ease, is to remember this. Even though you have to work twice as hard, guess what the surprise to the world is? God gives without counting. So as a result of your history, your experience, your circumstances, your situation, God has equipped you with additional tools. And because you have this other thing, what I call additional tools, what some think you can't do, the Men of Honor, the movie Men of Honor, Cuba Gooding, in Betraying Back, and he goes down underneath the water. They break up the tools, the screws, to the bottom of the sea, and he finds them in midnight. There is a natural thing that is working. There are other forces, angels, whatever you want to call them, in the actual environment that makes that ability to work twice as hard easy for you. It's almost like a dance. And so don't sweat something easy.
This might be my last question for you today. So how has your grandmother being a slave and the experiences she went through, how has it shaped you? How did it contribute to shaping you into the man that you are today? So if you want to say, I have become the way I am today, how much of that do you get from that history?
A lot. I'm motivated as I speak. I often, sometimes in certain circles, I would say, preach, Virgins boy, preach, because I have to say, well, you know what? My mother, as a result of her experience, didn't understand me. And it kind of motivates me to move forward because, you know, I have to say to myself, internally, she didn't win. The side of her that decided to be, took on the role of the monster. But my grandmother, where she started at, and remembering vividly her memory of whatever that day was in April when emancipation took place, I feel like I'm living for her. So, and not just living for her, because, you know, it's interesting when you have a bond. You can have children. Not all of your children you're going to have bonds with, believe you me. I had a special bond with my grandmother. I don't know why. Probably mystically, she had a bond with me. And as I told you all this earlier, my grandmother didn't have much of a bond with most children. And she certainly, I'm being the youngest of the children, she kind of took to me. But once I heard her experience, I never asked her too much about it, because in older people in those days didn't particularly care for conversations with children, so you had to be silent. And I just observed her, and her, even the time I burnt my finger, and she thought she said she was talking the fire out of my hand. And she had told my mother, I really want to spend time with him. I want to teach him the art of, she didn't say the art, but to teach me her mystical sciences. And I never learned those mystical sciences. I was always anti-superstitions, anti-mystical sciences. But later on, in studying African religions and traditions and how they came to America, I began to see that her belief system was more of the African cosmology than it was what we call Western cosmology. Now, isn't that different? I'm about 100 years away from her, some years, and I think in a more scientific and global sense. And as I was telling someone just prior to being on this program, I am from a family of 13, and the person wanted to make a contribution to my other work, which is the Urban Peace Ministry, which we are hoping to launch here in the United States and eventually throughout the Western world to stop the violence, the killings. And I told the person, I didn't know they had researched me, and they asked me, what happened to your other brothers? And I almost momentarily caught myself. And I almost cried because my other 3 brothers just didn't have the opportunity that I had. And I'm very fortunate that I came along at the time of my father's he was sagacious at the time, and I came along old enough to remember my grandmother and have conversation. So she impressed upon me without words a kind of spirit that I felt I was living for those people that couldn't speak for themselves. And I would really urge our audience to read a book called Lay My Burdens Down. It's a 9-volume history of slavery. It's in their own words. I mean, I went to Columbia University one day to listen to them, and I could only stand 2 days. I could listen, then I'd go back and take it in doses. It's now in written form. It's collected by a man by the name of Borkin. Much of what I have done most of my life has been studying voluminous amounts of work on slavery, so as to bring about the healing of African American people. We now know from study of genetics, there are epigenetics. And as I stated, while I had one brother who was United States Navy person in World War II, I had another brother who was a United States Marine. I had another brother that fell through the cracks, and he didn't go to the United States Penitentiary. He did go to the State Penitentiary of Virginia. So I think, this epigenetics, these tendencies that are there, I'm a big stickler for understanding our history, and so as to better understand ourselves. As much as I perhaps would want to own my brother that's went to jail, he's passed on, God grant him the paradise, and my other brother who was a United States Marine but had the unfortunate part to be a sentry at the United States Marine barracks in Rabat, Morocco, and had to kill a young man that breached the embassy ground. So I'm informed by all those people, so I'm grateful. I think it's good to know who you are. I think you can't get drunk on it. But what is the lesson? What do you learn from that? And I am just so honored to, and really emotionally moved to be with you all today, the African thinkers. I appreciate you having me on. And I think that to the extent that we're going to be free, we have to be independent thinkers, not married and collected into the ideology, not pigeonholed into any mental ghettos, but we have to be free-minded to think on problems and figure out what's the best way for human beings.
Just one final question, and I promise I'll let you go, because I can't allow you to go without asking this question. Speaking of prison, I just read a quote now from a German prison director saying, if you treat men as if they are your enemy. They will react as your enemies. They will react as dangerous. And I just read a little bit about how the conditions are in some German prisons and how conditions are in some Norwegian prisons. You mentioned in one of the broadcasts or conversations you had previously that you worked at Rikers Island, and you mentioned, I just want to know your thoughts about prison reform, prisons in general. I also want to know about your thoughts about Black men being disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system. It's also a little bit similar in the UK as well. We have this idea that Black people, there's a stereotype of violence. Is it wholly wrong, or do many Black men, some women play into these stereotypes? What are your thoughts also about the prison system in the United States?
I'm going to first answer your question, and then I'm going to work backwards to the causation. My two uncles, well, I can work forward. My two uncles, my grandmother, Lula Nowlin, that she favored. There's a tendency in African American families, I don't know about other families, to favor the bad boy. And music genres, namely gangster rap, has valorized the bad boy, has valorized the person who breaks the law. I think even Bob Dylan in one of his songs said, to live outside of the law, you got to be honest. Well, I think to live outside the law, you got to be dishonest. So Dylan, even him in the 60s, was prepared, without knowing it, was preparing people to be rebels. And the person who break the law and commit crimes is looked up to. I remember, I'm gonna get to your question. I hope I'm getting to it. My brother, God bless his soul, shot a man in the face. So he called me from prison, and he said, he said, well, so how you doing, man? You're 60-some years old. You're in jail, man. What is it like? That must be rough. He said, no, it's not that bad. Said, oh, okay. Well, you know what? He said, and if y'all had gotten a better lawyer for me, I probably wouldn't be in jail. I would have got no time. I said, oh, you got off easy. And I said, you know what? Don't you ever call here again. I'm taking no more calls from you. And one of my sons said, as a result of that, he said that told him to never go to jail. Because if his father would talk to his brother like that, he knew he would not go to jail. And again, this goes back to some of my history. My mother wouldn't allow my father to affect that brother. So that brother was the bad boy. He kind of took the place of me not being a bad boy. And if my mother had coddled me and treated me like him, I probably would end up in prison. So that's the first thing. And remember, I started off talking about a chapter in E. Franklin Frazier's book, Mother in Bondage. We have to go back and study that. Now let's get to corrections. I had sent to a friend of mine through the mayor of New York, which I happened to know when he was a patrolman. I advocated the first thing to do is to take Rikers Island back by force. Then to work backwards. First, bring it in order. If you have to put 5,000 National Guard in to stop the slashing, the prisoners are running the place. Then number two, I would institute where the people who are less violent or non-violent, I would actually have those people in a collegiate-like setting, and I would not call them inmates. I would do like when I worked at Rikers, I'd call the people Mr. So-and-so, Mr. Brown, Mr. Jones. I'm not going to rob that man of his humanity, even if he's robbed himself of his humanity. So I refuse to call prisoners inmates. Now, in the federal system, I got in a lot of trouble for that. And I knew it was time to go. Because I refuse to want to call inmates inmates. I'm not going to take his dignity. And I always tell a guy, if you have taken your dignity away from me, I'm not going to aid you in destroying yourself. And they would look at me, and you know what? Prisons can be very dangerous, but the prisoners protected me because I was that kind of guy. But I would have smaller prisons. They wouldn't be no more than 100, and I would run them very much like the Germans and the Norwegians. For the dangerous people, and I would also have conjugal visits. Secondly, I think the American, there needs to be a committee formed. I plan to form a National Fairness Committee to see what we should really do with many of these people in jail that shouldn't be in there. I mean, you know, something wrong with a country that has 4 million. Now, there is some control there. But here's my message to those people. If your enemy sets up a trap for you, don't be a damn fool and walk into it. I tell them this way. This I talk to people. Well, you know, I'm a very frank person, even with people who are very dangerous. I said to them, if they want to make you a fool, don't be a damn fool. You may be a fool, but it's not all right to be a damn fool. So you see the trap set for you, because you know the average drug dealer is still living with his mother. The few kingpins, and some of the people they call kingpins, who are done 30 years in jail, are really the exception. So I think we need to look at the whole criminal justice system. And one of the things we're going to do with the Urban Peace Ministry is we're going to have ex-convicts, people who did life in prison, people who've been really reformed, mostly murderers who've done 30 years in jail, so they can go through the streets telling these young people that if you want to have the glitz and the glamour, you want to be Big Meech and all the rest of these guys, then look, Rick Ross is a piece of entertainment. He's an ex-correctional officer. My advice to you, don't take that lifestyle, because it is a death style. But I'm for total reform. I'm also for changing the culture of the society. And we have to fight the cultural powers that are producing this criminal-inducing lifestyle, while not romanticizing criminals, because the people who suffer the most in the neighborhoods are really the people in the neighborhoods. African Americans suffer the most from criminals who rob, steal, and create chaos.
Thank you very much.
Amazing.
Imam Alfred, it's been a pleasure talking with you. I want to do this with you every day, even though I know it's not possible. But there's just so much wisdom that you've unpacked for us today, and we really, really appreciate your time and your efforts. And we hope that a lot of people who are going to hear this message, they're going to have a rethink. Those who are not thinking in this line will have a rethink and say, you know, if someone who has had these terrible experiences, who was shaped directly by slavery, if they could have this positive outlook in life, then there is no excuse for those of us in this age who were born when things are way better. There are no excuses for us to want to act any better. So thank you very much for coming to the stream today, and we hope to catch you soon in another conversation.